Rory Burns has now played 25 tests and he averages 33. That seems really low. But in some ways it isn't. In this current English team it is actually the second highest average. If Stokes and Butler were back, it would be the fourth highest. There are a bunch of reasons why Burns is in this team despite that average. Facing the new ball in an era where England has struggled to produce openers since Alistair Cook. Allowing him to step down from the captaincy was fair, but he was clearly a world-class opener, and even on the wane, better than anything England could find. Think of it this way, they couldn't find any partners for him, and now they had to find two of him. I've been very obsessed for a long time with what England did at the non-Cook end, that I even made it into Cook's autobiography talking about the subject. Over time, I've made quite a few of these things. I won't show them all to you. I kind of want to, but the point is that England have been struggling for so long that I've been able to develop a new skill through their misery. My favourite stat of the era is that Cook has a faster strike rate than Alex Hales, who was brought in specifically to give the ball a whack. Think about this. Even a player as well regarded as Cook, someone knighted barely a moment after he played, ended up with a batting average of 45.35. And if that seems low for someone who's a great to the game, let me educate you some. In Ben Jones and Nathan Lehman's book, Hitting Against the Spin, they talk about opening the batting. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but they basically say if a great player averages 50 and a good player averages 45, for an opener it should be 45 and 40. And I think I'd go even further and say that those numbers for England could be even closer to 40 and 35. It is really tough to face the new ball in England. And this is a similar thing that I told Shan Masood after he failed the first time in England. Averaging 35 in England as an overseas opener, when you've chewed up quite a few balls along the way, is actually a win for a travelling opener. The point is that when we judge English batters, we quite often don't account for this. I don't do much advanced metrics for tests, but allowing for conditions is obviously a big part of working out a player's real record. Clearly England now look well beyond that and they use things like expected average. But for this particular video, we'll just look at a bit more basics. In Test cricket over the last 5 years, top 7 batters averaged 32.77 in England. In Australia and Zimbabwe, batters are over 39. The global average is 35.16. With the new ball, England openers average 29.34. The global mark is 33.99. But anyone who's been watching Test cricket over the last couple of years will know that something quite seismic started happening at the start of 2018. Seam bowlers started taking a lot more wickets than they used to. So let's put these two things together. England average lower than other teams, and seam is dominating pretty much everywhere around the world at the moment. In England, the average is lower historically, and this has also been a historically low time for facing seamers. Right now, bar a few holdouts, hi New Zealand, it's almost impossible to score runs from seamers outside of Asia. England's place here is not surprising, but England is low, but it's been a tough few years to make any runs against the red ball when it's bowled at pace in England. And you can see this when you look at the English player numbers. They look depressed. I mean, in truth, they look horrible. But we do need to take a closer look. So let's start with Joe Root, because he is quite obviously far and away their best player. He is their only locked-in test batter that they have. And away from home, he's been freaking incredible. And at home, he's not been. It is quite clear just how much he has struggled here. And if we look even more specifically, against pace alone, he's averaging 30. And this isn't an average player. Forget his spot in the Big Four, let's look at all the English players with over 2,000 runs since 1980. He's still got the best average. He's a way above average English player no matter how you slice all this up. And he's been averaging 30 against pace in the UK for well over 3 years now. So imagine being a normal player arriving in this. Let's pick someone at random. Johnny Bairstow. I have not picked him at random. There were times when Bairstow looked like he was in England's best 3 batters. That was before the whole Josh Butler thing kind of ruined his career. And I think he's batted in almost every position since then. Bairstow averaged 16 in this period when facing seamers at home. And you can see just how ridiculous this is. Look at his damn average against spin in England. If he could have just found a way to even just hold his own against seam, he would have been okay. Instead, he was basically a tail ender against it. Bairstow had a weakness against the balls at the stumps. Even over-pitched balls get him. And he ran into an era when the seamers were all on fire and he couldn't handle it. Let's just go to the other end of this one for a minute. If Bairstow is the worst case scenario, then Stokes is the best. Stokes' career batting average is 37, and yet here he is knocking seamers around at almost an average of 50 during a seam-playing pandemic in England. It's a remarkable record, more so because he can bowl as well. Stokes is brilliant in the UK, and he's poor away from home. And let's focus on another player with all-round skill, Josh Butler. If you look at his career average of 36, it doesn't seem too good. But in England's best team, that has him just behind Stokes as the third best average. And as far as wicket-keepers go, that's a really good mark. The great thing is, right at the moment, he'd get into this team for his batting alone. The terrible thing is, he'd get into this team on batting alone. Butler comes with his own limitations. That's why he averages 36. And like Stokes, he's been so good at home, but he has struggled when he's gone away. But you can see that so has everyone except for Root. England can't buy runs when travelling, and at home, they're struggling to hold on just as much. Let's look at the next big hope, Pope. When Ollie Pope was smashing the South Africans everywhere and had the greatest county batting average of all time, TalkSport gave me a job as an analyst to try and work him out. I didn't have that much to go on, but looking at his first class record, I could see that he was a very slow scorer against spin. He didn't go out to it much, but he really struggled to score off it. And when you see a non-Asian batter with that in his record, you know he's about to face better spinners more often and on friendlier surfaces. It's certainly something to keep in your mind. Anyway, I bring all this up because this is Pope's averages against pace bowling and spin. And so far he has struggled against a spinning ball. And if you think, as I did, that this is partly because he was so horrible in Asia, sure, you're right, he averaged 17 against spin there. I mean, he also averages 17 against spin in the UK. This isn't terminal, but while he's batting at 5 or lower, it's a concern just because of the amount of spin he will face. But let's go up to the top for a minute. All of England's 3 most used openers are right here. Cook is obviously gone, so let's focus on Sibley and Burns. Neither of these records look incredible, but considering how hard scoring runs against seamers in England has been, I think they should be pretty happy with this. But let's start with Sibley. Dom Sibley may be the most one-dimensional player in the sport today. In Test cricket from seamers, he has hit 7 boundaries through the covers. That's a remarkable record. And you can see he's just not like other Test batters at all. It's maybe pushing it to say that most of his runs on the offside are from outside edges, but a lot of his runs on the offside are from outside edges. And then there's his strike rate, which is obviously noticeable. He is the slowest batter in the dip. And contrary to what most people believe, we have a lot of slow coaches around right now. And here he is, right at the top, or bottom, or whatever. Now in a normal era, I actually think this would be quite handy, as he'd be taking the lacquer off the ball. But seamers are doing well all the way through the innings, so I'm not sure he's really blunting their effectiveness, except for the occasional very long inning. And as good as Sibley has been, he's just not making any runs. You can add as many justifiable caveats as you'd like. At a certain point, he has to make more runs. Averaging 31 just isn't good enough. And while we're at the top, one of the other players at the top order is Zach Crawley, who has made a handful of first-class hundreds in his life and has been groomed to bat at 3 in an Ashes when his first-class average is still 32. He had to come into the sport when he was 21, and 21-year-olds don't make many runs in Test cricket. Even when you factor in how naturally talented you need to be in order to gain selection at that age. Top 6 batters between the ages of 20 and 22 average only 32. In the 2 years of Test cricket before Crawley came in, top 3 players only averaged 32. So I keep saying 32 a lot here, but sadly for Crawley, he actually averages under 30 in Test cricket right now. Crawley is clearly good enough to make a double 100 in Tests, but he's also averaged 10.25 in his innings since then. And if Crawley keeps failing, perhaps the most logical person to replace him is James Bracey. I don't think you can focus too much on the fact that Bracey didn't score in his first 2 innings, or whatever that sweep was in his last innings, but his first class average is 36. So England are struggling at home, away, against seam, and with their backups. And we haven't even talked about spin yet. We haven't talked about the fact that a lot of their left-handers struggle with off-spin, and we haven't talked about quite a few other factors there. And that's a problem because they also struggle with spin. Look at what happened when they toured Sri Lanka and India. Outside of Root, their batters basically made negative runs on that tour. And you could, if you wanted to, go through each player and look at their weaknesses against spin, but I've already done that before. And all of this brings us back to Burns, who does struggle against off-spin. But I want to bring in other openers here. English openers should be judged against each other more, because their job is a little bit different than most of the jobs in cricket. So let's add Mike Atherton and Alistair Cook to this. I've only used Atherton's opening average, because the rest of his career is junk. These are just their basic numbers, and it's quite clear who is the better player. But I want to look at something completely different. We know that in these eras, batting has been wildly different. Atherton and Cook both had longer careers where batting was at various times easier and harder. This is how much better they are than an average opener. Clearly Cook is still really good, but Atherton's numbers in context suddenly look a lot better. And remember, he did most of this with a bat made of wafer thin biscuits. And even Burns is above average, but think about why I used Athers and Cook here. Cook played in an incredible batting era and still was very, very dominant. Athers played in a much tougher batting era. although the opening batting average was pretty much exactly the same, and was still clearly an above average opener for over a decade. Burns is just nothing like that. And that's okay, no one's expecting him to be, but he's got the 4th best average of any English player right now. I think what all this shows is that Burns is not as bad as his average instantly shows to you. He's a slightly above average opener right now. And he's England's 4th best batter. And I think that's where the problem is. There is a global seam playing pandemic, and they did get some huge turners away from home, and they clearly aren't in a golden age of batting. But all of that ends up with this sorry looking thing. This is a team who right now doesn't have a single batter who can handle most of the conditions in Test cricket. You can say that England has poor conditions, but this is where their batters appear on the averages over the last 5 years. These are the guys who made it to 750 runs, so it's not even including the ones who failed and were discarded early. Raw numbers don't really tell the full story, but there are no numbers that make England batters look good at the moment. Their numbers seem really low, and in some ways they aren't, but they're also not good. Put it this way, their top order is much closer to the bottom of the table than they'd ever feel comfortable with.